welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be here. So yeah, my name's Tor Mitchell. I'm going to be talking about product management today. And the goal here is to familiarise you with product management, if it's something you're not already familiar with. Talk a bit about things you need to understand to decide if it's the right career path for you. And then also talk a bit about how you might get started in product management. Okay, so first though, a little bit about me. I think we covered this briefly, but I was at Oxford studying physics back in 1993. It sounds a lot further back than I remember it. It only feels like yesterday. I was saying, my wife came up with me today, and I was saying as we walked up from the railway station, I said, you know, this part of town was not one I used to come to that often. I was at Pembroke. But I know it well enough that it sort of feels slightly freakily familiar, but it's changed a lot. But I spent 4 years here in Oxford until 97, and then got a job with Sun Microsystems. Not sure how many of you remember Sun Microsystems, but they were a pretty significant player in networking and computing infrastructure in the late 90s. They were a company that really benefited greatly from the dot-com explosion in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they're a company that suffered greatly from the dot-com implosion shortly thereafter. And I was with them throughout that whole period, which is a fascinating time. Started out with them here in the UK, and then spent 3.5 years with them in Silicon Valley, before heading back home to join Google. Started with Google in London in 2006, still again more on the engineering side. I've never really been a developer per se. I mean, I studied physics rather than computer science. So I tended to do more support roles, fixing people's networks, that sort of thing. And with Google, I was in London for 1.5 years, and then I moved to Sydney in Australia. I was in Australia for 5 years working on Google Maps, and then moved on to back again to Silicon Valley, to their Mountain View headquarters for another couple of years. And it was while I was at Google, while I was in Australia actually, that I first became really aware of product management as a role. It wasn't something I'd really been familiar with up to that point. And the more time I spent with product managers, the more attractive the role seemed to me, the more it seemed to resonate with my skills and what I'd been looking for. You know, I didn't graduate wanting to be a support engineer. It was just a way in. I was always looking for something. And eventually, when it came to product management, I found it. And so I worked with Google for 9 years. And about 2 years ago, Yeah, I just want to clarify. So your role in Sun Microsystems was more in hardware, and then you made the switch to software. I've always been in software. So when I started out at Sun, I joined their support organisation in the UK, and I was on the team that supported networking, essentially, networking problems. So the back history here is while I was at university, I got a summer job at an internet service provider in my hometown of Bournemouth. This was in 1995. So this was very early, just as the internet was breaking out of universities into the mainstream. And it was before Windows 95 had even launched, so it was still like Windows 3.1, which wasn't really built for the internet. So it was an interesting time. But I held this summer job, which turned into a job that I kind of kept doing even when I was back at university for a couple of years, and really learnt a lot about the internet as it was at that time, and that got me the role at Sun. So Sun, I was working in networking support, so I was looking after people's mail servers, Ethernet networks, DNS servers, that sort of thing. And then moved into what's called sustaining engineering, which is the team that sits between support and development. They basically manage the code base of released products, so patches, service packs, maintenance releases, those sorts of things. So that was the closest I've ever got to real software development, in a sense. Because when I went to Google, I sort of took a step back and went back into more of a support role, just because it was Google. And started out on supporting their search appliances, which you don't hear very much about, but they used to sell, I think they still do, these rack-mounted servers that you can put into data centers to add Google to the inside of your company, back when people still had data centers, and when they had intranets and that sort of thing. And then progress from there onto the map side. Now, Google have a business selling their mapping services to companies. So if you're a TripAdvisor or you're a big website that needs to use maps on your site, you can buy a support agreement and an SLA and a whole bunch of other things. And so I was on the team that was helping those, there was about 3 of us, was helping those customers. And then I moved into product management from there, working on a similar product set. And then, last year decided it was time to move back home, and spoke to about 30 different startups all over the UK. Eventually landed at Crowdcube, who are an equity crowdfunding platform based down in Exeter. So, one of the first things I was asked to do,
Okay. Sorry to interrupt. If you are taking questions later.
No, it's fine.
Any specific reason you chose to come back to startup? You could have gone.
Yes, that's a great question. So why did I come back to a startup? I could easily have moved back with Google. And I use the word easily in two ways. One is it would have been an easy decision, but also it would have made the whole process much easier. Because if you decide to move countries with Google, you go to a website, you find a role in that country, you hit an apply button, and then the machine kicks in that moves you and your whole family and all your possessions and sorts out your visas and everything for you. I'm not saying it's not completely stress-free, but it's certainly a lot easier than doing it yourself, which is what I ended up having to do. But the reality was that I've been at Google for 9 years. I joined them in 2006, back when there were 3,500 people. All they had was Maps, search, and Gmail. It's a bit of an approximation, but you compare it to the huge breadth of products they have now. It's a very different company. And I've been with them for that long, but critically, the last 7 years of that 9 years, 7.5, I'd always been working for them abroad, and therefore was tied to them by some kind of work visa. So I never even had the option of doing anything different. And when I left the UK in 2007, there was no real startup scene to speak of. And it really exploded while I was away. It kind of blossomed over the last 7 or 8 years. And I'd never worked for a small company. I'd never worked for a startup. And I felt like this is the first opportunity I had once we decided to move back to do that for a very long time. I also felt that I was at risk of becoming institutionalized. Google is a great place to work. I highly recommend it to anybody who gets the opportunity. They treated me extraordinarily well. And it is a bit of a shock to work for somewhere that doesn't have free food and doesn't have massage, doesn't have all this crazy stuff. So I felt it was good for me. And also, to be honest, without meaning to seem too Machiavellian, the company has grown very quickly and continues to grow very quickly. Google gets over 1,000 CVs a week and hires, often hires over 100 people a week. It grows very, very quickly. And so as the organization of that scale expands around you, even if you're moving up at a reasonable rate, it's hard to make significant progress. And having spent that time at Google and having learned a lot about how the company operates, I was aware that it would perhaps be beneficial to me to move outside the company in order to progress my career. You see this happen a lot. A lot of people will get to a certain point at Google and then they'll move out, they'll get some experience elsewhere, and then they'll potentially come back at a later date. Okay, so I was at Crowdcube. I've been brought in to lead their product team, and we'll talk a bit about what that means in a minute. But one of the first things I need to do is build that team, just hire some people. At Google, they have a program that we'll talk about on a few occasions through this deck, because it's quite important, called the Associate Product Manager Program. And it's their graduate recruiting and training program for product managers. And it's really set the template for those programs across the industry. I worked with a number of people who were on that program, and they were stellar. And I was very conscious that graduates in general can make great product managers as long as they have the appropriate support and mentoring. And I was keen that my team contributes to that. So I started recruiting for 2 roles. One was an experienced product manager role. I needed a couple of those. But I was also open to hiring a graduate, and so I posted this job. And it goes on a little bit beyond here, but this is the crux of it. Which is a role for an entry-level product manager. And it turned out to be extremely difficult to fill. I did eventually end up reviewing over 100 resumes to fill this position. And we did eventually manage to fill it with a really strong candidate who happened to live locally. But obviously, it being in Exeter made life a little harder. But one of the biggest challenges we faced was a lack of awareness amongst students of product management as a career path. So potential candidates were not seeking out roles that looked like this. They were not recognizing this role as something they might be interested in when they saw it in a listing. And that lack of awareness worried me greatly. Because the reality is that although product management isn't that well understood and perhaps not as well, certainly not as well established in the UK as it is abroad, it is becoming a very central function to technology companies. And if the UK startup ecosystem is going to continue to grow, it will generate demand for product managers, which we have to fill somehow, and we can't just rely on people moving into the role sideways opportunistically. We need a pipeline, and there is no pipeline. So this presentation essentially is my first attempt to address that problem. It's relatively new. This is only the second time I've given it, but hopefully it's something that I can make a habit of. Okay, so I briefly mentioned this earlier. This is the sort of the basic structure of this presentation. What is a product manager? Is it right for you? And how do you become one? Also worth mentioning that even if you decide that you may not be interested in product management once you understand it, it's probably still a good thing to know what the role is and what's involved, because you may well cross paths with product managers, and it's good to know what you're up against. Okay. So something else I would say, in fairness, is I feel like this audience, this program, this institution, if you like, perhaps has a bit of a head start here. Product management maybe has a little a higher profile here than elsewhere. So if a lot of this stuff is familiar to you, I apologise. But just in case, we'll work through it anyway. Something else worth mentioning is that certainly in technology, we just talk about product managers all the time. And we take it as a given that we're talking about product management in technology, but often you see this referred to as digital product management. That's really what I'll be talking about today. Product management as a discipline is beginning to expand outside of technology into other disciplines, but I can't really speak to that experience, and I think it's quite different. Okay, so before we define the role of a product manager, let's first briefly define what we mean by a product. It's kind of an obvious thing, but worth mentioning. Any hardware, software, or service offered to consumers or businesses. So that could be a smart thermostat, it could be a game on your phone, it could be an online form for renewing your car tax. Any of these things are digital products that might have a product manager or benefit from one. If I was going to sum up the responsibility of a product manager in one phrase, this is the phrase I'd use: they own the success of the product. And that spans out to a million different things, but at its heart, your job is to ensure your product is successful. So how do you do that? Well, the analogy, my favourite analogy, is the conductor of an orchestra. So the conductor decides what music should be played, and then leads the musicians to collectively deliver the best possible experience for the audience. And in a similar way, a product manager decides what needs to be built, and then coordinates all the different functions involved in delivering the best possible experience for users. And really, those two pieces I mentioned there, they are reflected in the sort of the life cycle of a product, and the way that the product manager's role changes during that life cycle. So there's the planning stage, where we're figuring out what to build, and there's the delivery stage, where we're actually building it. So let's break that down and look at what you do in each of those stages. So first, plan. I mentioned a moment ago that the job of a product manager is to drive the success of a product. But you can't really figure out how to make a product successful until you know what success looks like. So the first thing is you need a vision for the product. Why does the product exist? What is it trying to achieve? What problems will it solve for users? As the product manager, you own that vision, and it's your job to evangelize that vision out to all the people who are involved and get them excited about this and get them engaged to help you make this happen. Once you've got a vision, you need a strategy. How are you going to deliver on that vision? And how will, in doing so, you deliver value to the business? Products have to pay for themselves, so there has to be a balance of value to the users and the business. Once you have a strategy, then you need a roadmap. So you need a path from where you are to where you want to be. And that roadmap will consist of a sequence of releases or milestones along the way. And each of those milestones, each of those releases, will have a set of requirements. And this set of requirements will be a set of features, essentially, or improvements that you negotiate with the development team. Right? It's important to understand that you're not a dictator here. You don't get to just decide this stuff and force it on people. It's a conversation. Yeah?
Or a quick question. Can we have a copy of the presentation?
Yes, definitely. Yes. So you don't get to decide unilaterally. You have to negotiate, because ultimately you are representing users, you're representing the business, and your engineering counterpart is representing what is possible, what is practical, what the technology enables and allows. And between you have to figure out what can we realistically deliver and on what time scale. So you're balancing time, resources, and requirements, and agreeing essentially a negotiation. The way in which we convey these requirements as product managers is what we call user stories, which essentially is a way of defining a requirement without opining on the implementation in any way. So it's a way of saying, as a user, I want to be able to carry my train ticket on my phone. That's a very simple user story. But it doesn't say anything about how that should actually be implemented. Okay. So as a product manager, you own this whole chain from top to bottom, and you carry it with you in your head at all times. You're constantly checking that what you're doing aligns with the vision, is in keeping with your strategy, and that you're on track with your roadmap. So that was the planning. Once the planning is complete, you move into the delivery phase. So at this stage, the requirements have all been agreed. They're in the hands of the designers and engineers who will actually build the product or evolve the product. What do you do as a product manager during this part of the lifecycle? Well, you have a number of responsibilities. The first thing is managing the schedule. So, as I mentioned, you negotiated a schedule back in the planning stage. Now you need to make sure things are on track. If roadblocks come up, it's up to you to figure out how to get past them. This is essentially project management. This is kind of classical project management. And at large companies, you may well have a dedicated project manager who works with you and handles a lot of this work. I often get asked, what is the difference between a project manager and a product manager? And this is what project managers do. They manage delivery and the timeline and the schedule and keep things on track. But they don't have that broader strategic ownership, and they don't have that responsibility to users and the user experience. They just focus on the delivery piece. If you've got one, it's amazing, because this is a source of massive stress. So handing that off to someone is great. But in smaller companies, particularly at startups, this will fall on your shoulders. Okay. So you are the maker of trivial decisions. What I mean by this is, no matter how good you are at writing a specification, how good you are at conveying the way the product will behave, all day, every day, tons of tiny little decisions will bubble up from the engineering team. What colour should this be? What should the text be on that button? If I click this, that happens. Is that right? There's this corner case we haven't considered. What about these users over here who have already signed up before and now we're changing that process? Someone needs to make these decisions, and they're not necessarily super important decisions. They're not necessarily really hard decisions, but unless someone is empowered to make them, everything just grinds to a halt because nobody knows what to do. And so your job as a product manager is to get those decisions made, to either make them yourself if you feel that's appropriate, or to pull together the right set of people to make them and keep things moving forward. So that's sort of day-to-day guidance. I mentioned earlier that you represent users here. So essentially you are the user advocate to this product team. And therefore, you're the first user. You're the first person who tests this product. You're the first advocate for this product. You're the one person who, more than any other, should be obsessing over the fine details of what makes a product great. And fighting the good fight to ensure the little things get addressed. Because in the heat of battle, it's very easy to say, yeah, I agree, that would be nice, but it's not super critical and we're up against a schedule. We'll come back to it. And that keeps happening and it keeps happening and it keeps happening. And you end up shipping something that's functional, but it's not fantastic. So you need to be that person who's advocating for doing the best you can possibly do. And lastly, at some point you're going to have to get this thing out. And what does it take to coordinate a launch? Now, launches are very different things for different products. For a software as a service, it might be a tiny incremental change that happens on a daily basis. But sometimes you have a press event or you have some major new feature where actually you've decided to stack a load of stuff up and have a big bang. And to do that, you need a go-to-market strategy. You need to agree with the marketing team what your messaging is going to be, blog posts and press. You need to work with the legal team to make sure you're satisfying privacy and security concerns, that the support team are ready to answer questions, that the sales team have been briefed on the new features. It depends again on the product, but there are all these other functions. that need to be ready, and it's up to you to make sure that's the case and make sure every T is crossed and every I is dotted, so that when the day comes, you're good to go. So hopefully from all this, you can get a sense that actually, as a product manager, you end up working with an extraordinarily large number of different functions. And you spend more time with some than others, don't get me wrong. You spend a lot more time, for example, with engineering than you would with PR, for example. But you get to work with all these different functions, and as a consequence, although you don't become an expert in any of these fields, you do develop a basic understanding of some of the fundamental principles of many of these things, the sensitivities, the concerns, the things they have to worry about. And that's one of the things that makes the role so valuable, because you have this very broad skill set. So I'm not sure whether, this is a video, it remains to be seen whether this will work. Might do actually, if we turn the TV on. So one of the things I've been doing as part of this project is interviewing successful product managers just to get a sense of how they came into the role, what they love about it, and what advice they would give to people interested in it. This is a guy called Marty Kagan. He runs something called Silicon Valley Product Group. He was originally, or previously, a senior product management leader at Netscape, and then at eBay, and now he consults and speaks about product management all around the world. And I chatted to him for about 5 minutes, and I just want to play a little clip that I think is really interesting and jives with what we were just talking about. Is it going to work?
It's an amazing job, and I think there's a very strong argument to say it is the most important non-executive position in a company. It's really second only to the CEO, and that is, you can't say that about a lot of jobs, and a lot of people have found that this is not only a great job and a great career, but it's a proving ground for eventually starting their own company. In fact, a lot of the best investors out there will only invest in someone who has proven they can be a product manager successfully.
So, on the off chance that didn't work, and in case you didn't get it, that's what he said. I think that's pretty compelling. I would agree to a large extent. What you find is a lot of product managers do go on to start their own companies, or go on to lead successful companies. I've got just a few examples here of people who have come up through product management and gone on to do pretty well. So, this guy called Brett Taylor. He was product manager on Google Maps, went on to found a company called FriendFeed that was acquired by Facebook, became the CTO of Facebook, and then left Facebook to start another company called Quip, who do document collaboration. What's his name? I haven't got it in the notes because I only added it at the last minute. This guy founded Instagram. He was he was a product manager before he did that. Jess founded Polyvore. She was a product manager at Google. Steph Hannon. She was originally the product manager of Google Wave. She's now Chief Technology Officer of Hillary Clinton's election campaign, and was listed as the 4th most influential woman in technology by Wired magazine earlier this year. Marissa, fairly well known, CEO of Yahoo now. She was the person who founded the APM program at Google, so she's fairly instrumental in getting graduates into product management. And of course, Sundar, who was originally product management for the Google toolbar, which doesn't even exist anymore, and then went on to do Chrome, and then went on to do Google Apps, and then went on to do Android, and then became CEO of Google. Okay, so I threw this in here because it seemed relevant. Some of you may be aware of this. This was an article in the Wall Street Journal just, I think it was in March, so pretty recent, talking about how product manager is now the most coveted role for MBAs in the US. But specifically, I think this was based on some research or some data from Harvard, actually. So there's definitely a strong awareness of the role over there. We just need to get to that point over here. One last thing worth mentioning, because I maybe haven't stressed it enough, is although the title is product manager, you manage products, you don't manage people. You don't actually have organizational authority over any of the people on that slide I showed you with all the functions. You operate entirely through influence. So you have to build persuasive cases for why things should be the way they are, or things should be done a certain way. In fact, as a product manager, the only people I'll ever manage are other product managers, eventually. Okay, so that was what is product management. Any questions? Awesome. Onwards. So let's talk about whether your product management is right for you, whether this is a role that you might be well suited to. Yes?
Going back a couple of slides, when you talk about strategy, you define the strategy. What all goes in there when you think of strategy? Is it you talk to customers? Is it you take your competition into account when you're defining the product strategy?
All of those things and more, I would say. So if we step back a step before that, so the question was, what factors go into defining a strategy for a product? Obviously you start from, let's say, the vision. You start from what you're trying to achieve. What's your long-term goal? What is the change that you're trying to affect in the long term? But also you also need to understand your users in detail, because all of your hypotheses about how users will behave are wrong. And that's just the law. So until you actually get out there and speak to them, it's very, very difficult to predict how they'll behave. It's very difficult to predict if the way they will use that product is the way you intended them to, or if the problems that they find the product solves for them are the problems you set out to solve. So a large part of the product management role, and we'll talk about this a little bit in a moment, is about empathizing. Empathizing with users, empathizing with colleagues, and so you have to go out there and listen and talk to them and understand their needs. And that may mean that your strategy changes, or even your vision changes if you realise that the problem you're trying to solve isn't a problem that needs solving. Or that it's not a problem that's sufficiently painful that people are willing to pay for a solution. The other thing, obviously, as you say, is what is the environment in which you're operating? What is the competitive environment? What is the technology environment? This is just my personal opinion. I like to be conscious of what the competition is doing, but I try not to obsess over it. And that's because I've seen on multiple occasions companies who get obsessed over the competition, and it never works out well for them. They just end up chasing tails. You could argue that one of the reasons that Sun struggled was because they became too obsessed with Microsoft. And they were very, very focused on that as a competitor, and they completely failed to notice the real risk that was developing over here, which was commodity PC hardware running Linux in data centers. That was a very formative experience for me, watching that happen. So now I very much stay focused on what should we do? How can we make the product better for our users? Rather than thinking, oh my goodness, they're doing this and we're not doing this, so we now need to do that. And I think the other aspect, of course, is in most cases this is a business. So the business has certain goals, but the business also has to be self-sustaining. So how are you going to make sure that the journey that you're on is going to take a certain amount of time, and you have to continue to bring in revenue over that period, and obviously the amount of value you're generating has to balance the amount of cost you're generating. So that's another thing you obviously always need to be conscious of, is really understanding what the costs are in the business. Crowdcube is an interesting case. We have our cost of business is mostly in the people who work with entrepreneurs to manage these raises, and so understanding, and those people are out there negotiating deals and negotiating commission rates and things like that. So we have to make sure that our cost of user acquisition and our cost of entrepreneur onboarding doesn't exceed the amount of commission we bring in from the business. Okay. So, this is going to break down into two real sections. The first is, are you right for product management? And the second is product management right for you? So, when you look at product managers, or when I look at successful product managers, there are a certain set of character traits that you consistently see in successful product managers. I'm going to go through them now, but I should start by saying I don't expect anybody, especially someone who's just starting out, to have all of these characteristics. That would be a bit much to ask. But if you look at this list and you think you see some of yourself in them, or you see in them characteristics that you would like to develop, then that suggests that product management would be good for you. So it's a leadership role. And I mentioned a moment ago that you don't actually manage people. So it's not a leadership role in the sense of telling people what to do. It's a leadership role in the sense of showing people the way. You have to be able to show people, give people a clear sense of direction, and give them confidence that there is a rationale to this approach that you're taking, and that the product is in safe hands with you. So you can probably tell, communication is critical. It's absolutely essential. You spend so much of your time communicating with users, communicating with business, communicating with engineers. Every single one of these audiences has a different communication style. And you are the universal translator. You need to be able to sit down with a salesperson who bangs their fists on the table and tells you why they have to have this feature and why it's stopping them closing a deal that will earn them, personally earn that individual, tens of thousands of pounds worth of commission that their family holiday to Hawaii is hinged on, and you have to be able to explain to them why the technology won't allow that. Or why, if we did that, we would sacrifice 10 other deals that are on the table. So you have to be able to act, and then lawyers, they have a whole other language. Marketing people, they have a whole other communication style. You need to be able to work across all these different teams. This might sound obvious, but you need to be someone with energy. You need to be passionate and enthusiastic, because your energy propagates outwards across the team. You'll tend to find, particularly engineering teams, they take their cues in terms of their emotional state from the product manager. If the product manager is upbeat, believes that we're on the right track, believes everything will be fine, then they will get on board. But if your mood starts to dip, if you've had a lot of setbacks, if your launch has been delayed and you don't stay up, then they will go down with you, and then it's a slippery slope. So you need to have, there's a practical side to this. I mean, you do need to actually get stuff done. We talked about attention to detail. The fact that there's so many different moving parts, you have to be organised, you have to keep everything together. When you're working with designers particularly, there's a key part of the role, which is communicating the user behaviours you want to facilitate and letting them take charge of coming up with creative ways to address that. But just as product managers are not dictators, neither are designers. They will not come back and say, this is the design, I am done here, peace out. They will come back with a variety of options. Right? They will say, well, there's a number of different ways that we can do this. And they will work with you to talk about which of these options perhaps do you feel is the most intuitive, which suits what we're trying to achieve here best, and which lays the right foundations for a long-term direction in terms of things we might want to add in future and that can accommodate that. What's your language with your users? So there's a creative side to this where you have to be able to have those conversations effectively, but also you need to be conscious of how technology is evolving and what new products and services and features it might facilitate that you could add to the product to make it better. So you have to be able to recognise opportunities. You have to be creative in terms of having ideas about ways in which the product can move forward. Data is at the heart of everything we do. There's a famous quote from Jim Barksdale, who was the CEO of Netscape, who said something along the lines of, if we need to make a decision, then if you have data, we'll use that. If all we have is opinions, we'll use mine. And so ultimately, without data, we're just operating blind. So really understanding what the user behaviours are, not just by talking to them, which is one way of doing it, but also in aggregate. So actually instrumenting the product in such a way that you can really get some insights into how users are behaving. And then make well-informed decisions based on that. You have to be curious. I've always been a little hesitant about using the word opinionated, because the word opinionated has negative connotations that I don't mean, but I've yet to find a better word, so if you have one, let me know. What I mean by opinionated is you have to be the type of person who's willing to express an opinion. You have to form opinions, you have to hold them, and then you have to express them in a constructive and respectful way. So, and that's certainly a particular character trait. It's hard to completely explain, but it's amazing how many times I sit down with people, and when they're given the opportunity, it turns out they have a million opinions about things that they've been like bottling up, but they didn't really feel comfortable expressing them. And as a product manager, you can never shy away from that. And lastly, humility. I think it's very important to remember that yes, you are a leader, yes, you are a communicator, yes, you have opinions, but ultimately, if you're going to build a good working relationship with other people, you need to demonstrate humility. So you need to be willing to take the blame when things go wrong and then give the credit to others. You need to value the ideas and opinions of people other than yourselves, especially people who are quite different from yourself. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty. And by that I mean, not everything that you do as a product manager is especially glamorous. Sometimes you've just got to do the grunt work. Sometimes you've just got to go out and get the pizza. And you've got to be happy to admit when you're wrong. Right? You've got to be able to say, okay, we did this, it didn't work out, turns out these assumptions were incorrect, the data shows otherwise, now we're going to go and do this instead. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what makes a good product manager. Now, why might you enjoy being a product manager? What is it that I enjoy about it? What is it that I think makes it a great role? You've probably already got the sense that there is a large amount of autonomy here. You're not just being told what to do. You're getting to decide for yourself not just what you do, but what a lot of different people should do. Something that matters greatly to me is a feeling that the work I'm doing is worthwhile. And what I mean by that is that it's actually contributing something meaningful, it's helping people, it's leaving a footprint on the world. This was one of the reasons it was so enjoyable for me to move from support into product management, because support is an important function. But if you're on the phone to someone whose computer is broken or whose map isn't working, they're obviously upset, you fix it for them, they're happy, and then they go back to their life. And it was as if it never happened. Whereas with product management, you're actually delivering something, you're actually making you have a concrete impact on the world. I mentioned you get to learn a lot of valuable skills. I think that's something certainly very important to me, to always be learning. All those people on that chart are different, and they're all interesting in their own ways. And if you enjoy interacting with lots of different people, then you'll enjoy this role. You're the only person who really understands everything that's going on, like everything that's going on around your product. And I know there are certainly some people who get quite frustrated where they don't understand what the rationale was for a particular decision, and there are other people who really just don't care. They just want to do their thing, and they're very happy doing it. But if you're that kind of person who really needs to understand the big picture, then this is where you need to be. An interesting thing I often remind more junior people when I'm mentoring them, particularly when they're about to go into a meeting or a presentation with the executive leadership team, for example. You tend to find that junior people go into meetings with the leadership team assuming that, maybe not consciously, but almost subconsciously, that they have perfect judgment and they know everything. And of course that's not the case. The reality is that if you go and present your product plan to your executive leadership team, no matter how junior you are, if you're the product manager, you know more about that topic than anybody else in the room. And that's quite empowering. I'll talk about this in a moment, but there are a lot of places you can go from here. Every day is different, sometimes dramatically so. And it's a lot of fun. I genuinely believe it's a lot of fun. I enjoy it greatly. And I know, most of the product managers I know would agree with me that it's just so diverse and so different and so exciting. Okay, so what are your long-term career? Yeah?
Well, I think you told about the MBA, but you said there's a unique list of long-term options.
Yes.
So for MBAs who plan to get into product management, what kind of long-term options, what are the broad categories?
I'm glad you asked. What are the long-term options? So here's just a selection of them. Obviously, product management at small companies is quite different to product management at large companies. The processes are different, the support that you get are different, the tooling is different, the degree of autonomy you have is also different. So there's a trade-off. The upshot is, if you start out doing product management at a small company, it would probably be an interesting experience for you to try it at a large one. And if you start at a large one, it would be interesting for you to try it at a small one. And that sort of cross-pollination between the two sides of the industry is very common. A lot of product managers, as I mentioned, will go on to start their own company. When Marissa was interviewed about the APM program at Google, she famously said that for any given cohort, they have an annual intake. For any given cohort, she would only expect at most half of them to still be at Google 5 years later. Because the type of people that program and that product management generally attracts are ambitious people, and many of them will aspire to run their own business. And product management is a really great grounding to do that. If you're maybe not wanting to go to start your own business, that's not your thing, or you're not ready, you tend to find that product management feeds the C-suite, as it were. People end up moving into CEO roles or COO roles from product management. There's also a CPO role, which is sort of another intermediate step. And this is perhaps a little different from the others because it's not so much a long-term thing, but I just thought it was worth mentioning that it's not a coincidence that I've moved around a lot. By being in product management, it's a very transferable skill. And I mean that both in terms of companies, but also in terms of geographical locations. It's not in any way constrained to one geography. In fact, at Google, they poll all the product managers every 6 months to ask them if they'd be interested in moving to another office, anywhere in the world, because they value that cross-pollination so much. And if you want to do that, they make it very, very easy. All right. So let's talk about compensation, obviously another important factor. I will start by caveating that the numbers on this slide are a little out of date in the sense that they're based on a salary survey that was done a few years ago, although I have adjusted them for inflation. The organisation that pulled this survey together is in the process of running another one, so I'll hopefully have better data soon. But I don't think this is too far off the mark. The point here is to illustrate that there's a good progression here, that you can certainly move on from a junior role, which is reasonably competitive in the graduate market. You would expect to be in a junior role for maybe 2 to 3 years, and then you move into sort of product manager, which is different companies have fairly different definitions for how long you're a product manager before you're a senior product manager. Again, this is one of those consequences of the role not being that well established in this country yet. But then you can move up from there. By the time you get to this point, you're on the leadership team, you report directly to the CEO, and you really have a very interesting and influential position. Okay. That was the end of that section. Any questions on why a product manager? Yes?
So, on the skills that a product manager should possess, can you speak about the technical skills? So, in terms of development or support activities?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that's often asked. I'm not going to deny that the majority of large technology companies who do have explicit graduate recruiting programs still mostly target their sourcing efforts at computer science graduates. Certainly, when I was at Google, the philosophy was very much that they wanted product managers to have a strong technology education. This is changing, actually. The job, even at Google, the job requirements have been updated recently. So they no longer say computer science degree, they say computer science degree or equivalent experience. And what I've certainly found when I've been recruiting and when I've been talking to other companies is there's a growing realization that the somewhat myopic focus on computer science graduates has actually caused a diversity problem in the industry. And I mean that both in terms of gender and other demographic factors, but also just in terms of mindset and skill set. So I mentioned earlier that we did manage to fill our graduate role. I filled that with an architecture graduate who's been phenomenal. There's another person on my team who did economics degree. So I think there's becoming a growing kind of acceptance that actually teams benefit from having a diverse range of skills. That having been said, one of the most essential capabilities as a product manager is to be able to maintain high bandwidth conversations with engineers. Right? So you need to be able to get decisions made quickly, which means they cannot spend half an hour explaining to you what a relational database is. You just need to be able to get to the point. So the important thing is not that you can sit down and write an app. The important thing is that you understand the concepts and the foundational stuff well enough that you can exchange information quickly with an engineering team. Because of all the teams that you spend time with, they are the people who you spend the most time with, and they're the people where the relationship is most critical to the success of the product. So the advice that I normally give, and I know others who've been asked this question often give, is just set yourself the task of building something. Even if you never release it to the world, just say, okay, I'm going to figure out for myself how I would build a tool to do this. And just give it a go, right? It could be an app on your phone, it could be a website, it could be a piece of desktop software. Just the process of working out, well, how do I plan this? What are the tools I would use? What's the basics of the language? I'm not suggesting that you need to get to the point where you could pass an engineering interview at Google, but that experience will just teach you so much about the developer mindset, about the challenges they're facing. Again, it's a lot about empathy as well. It would also be, if you wanted to take it a step further, it would be very beneficial to do something which will demonstrate that you have done this on your CV. Because certainly when I'm reviewing candidates, and we're going to talk a little bit about that process in a moment, I don't insist on a computer science degree, but I value evidence of some technical ability. So be that a project that you worked on, or meetups that you attend, or perhaps if you want to take it to the next step, you've done there's various sort of boot camp courses you can do in London and elsewhere. Makers Academy, or there's one called Founders and Coders, I think. These are the sort of things you could do where if you just need to get like an 8-week hit of technical skills, so you've got that in your backpack, as it were. But you don't necessarily want to do a 1-year, masters or something. That's a good compromise. All right, so last section. Let's assume that you're now like totally jazzed, man, and you want to do this. I've broken this up into 2 slides. One is large companies and one is small companies, and I don't want to imply any kind of bias. The reality, though, is that certainly it's the larger technology companies that have the established recruiting programs and training and mentoring programs for product managers. I'm in the process of actually doing a bunch of research on these programs to understand how they work, what their intake is, what their requirements are. It's interesting. But I'll just rattle through them. I mentioned Google already. They have this associate product management program. They run it all over the world. They also are relatively unusual in that they run internships. So they will run an APM internship over the summer, and I managed an APM intern while I was in Sydney. They don't have a dedicated website for the APM program, but they do have a dedicated website for student recruiting in general. Facebook, however, they have a similar program to the Associate Product Management Program called the Rotational Product Manager Program, or RPM, and they do have a dedicated website. I mentioned that the APM program was started by Marissa at Google. It was started because they were struggling to find product managers. When she left Google and went to Yahoo, she took the concept with her and set up another program, a similar program there. All of these 3 programs have a lot in common in terms of their structure. Essentially, they are rotational in the sense that you will move through a number of teams. At Google, I think it's 2 rotations each of a year. I think at Facebook, it's perhaps 3 with 6 months of each, so they move a little quicker. The idea is you get exposure to a number of different parts of the business. There's also a training element, and certainly for Google and possibly Yahoo as well, there's also an international trip where you go abroad for several weeks and you visit users in other countries and try and understand and empathize with other cultures. I've included Microsoft on here. They do have a graduate recruitment and training program. I don't know the details of it, but one thing I do know, and I want to stress, is that At Microsoft, the role that we've been talking about today is known as a program manager. And the role of product manager at Microsoft is actually more of a marketing function. So just be conscious of that. If you were looking at roles at Microsoft, you want to look at the program manager roles. To keep things confusing, program managers also exist in these other companies, but they're not product managers. They're more project managers. Okay. But let's suppose that you actually are more interested in smaller companies. Where would you look? So here's a few good places to start. Work in Startups is a site that has a lot of good UK jobs in the startup industry or startup sector, not just product manager jobs. It's a bit ghetto. It looks like it was built in like 1998 or something, but it works. AngelList is increasingly becoming the go-to place for technology jobs, particularly in Silicon Valley and increasingly in this country as well. It just has a very high caliber of people on it and good roles. In contrast to LinkedIn, LinkedIn is challenging because it's ubiquitous. Everybody's on LinkedIn. Every recruiter is on LinkedIn. Recruiters live and die by LinkedIn. But I can tell you, as a recruiter, that the consequence of this is that if you publish a role on LinkedIn, you get flooded with applicants, and the majority of them are not great. In a sense, LinkedIn makes it too easy to apply for a job because you can just go apply, and your profile will get sent to that person. So if you're going to apply for a job that you found on LinkedIn, my advice to you would be make a particular effort to separate yourself from other applicants. Craft a note to the hiring manager that explains who you are, why you're interested in this job. Don't just rely on the capabilities of LinkedIn to just fan your resume out. Mind the Product are a really interesting organisation that's worth keeping an eye on if you're interested in product management. They are a UK-based organisation, but they are becoming the de facto global community for product managers. They started out organising training and events in the UK, and they've expanded that now to the US. They run a big annual conference called Mind the Product, but they also run monthly meetups called Product Tank, and these now happen all over the world, not just in London as well. There's a Product Tank in Bristol, there's I think several further north as well, and they also run workshops. But the reason I've got them on here is because they recently launched a jobs board, and it's growing in popularity. Okay, so let's talk about how to craft a successful application. A lot of this stuff is fairly generic. It's not unique to product management. I apologise if you've all had like interview training and stuff, and this is all good and stuff that you're very familiar with already. But a few things I want to point out, again, just based on my experience hiring. I'm not going to tell you how to write a CV. I'm sure that's been covered. But I just want to stress that particularly, this comment may apply less to this audience, but particularly other student audiences I've spoken to, one of the challenges as a student is that your skill set and your experience is relatively undifferentiated from other candidates. So the important thing is to really stress what degrees of differentiation you do have. Do you have any relevant skills over and above the course that you've studied? Do you have any experience? Have you done any project work or participated in any events, for example, that would stand you out? And I put there examples of initiative or leadership. So you remember earlier me saying this is a leadership role. It's about, there's a communication element, there's a passion element. Anything you can do that demonstrates that sense of initiative, or anything you've done, even if it doesn't seem even mildly relevant to product management, even if it's just, if it's Duke of Edinburgh stuff, or if it's, that you ran a marathon, anything you can do to say, I'm someone who takes the initiative and is passionate and gets stuff done. I'm going to rattle through this again, but I don't want to patronise you all, but you would be horrified at how bad the majority of the cover letters I received were. Horrified. I would hope this goes without saying, but please use good written English. It's not just a question of attention to detail. It's actually highly pertinent to the role, because as a product manager, you are reviewing documentation, you are emailing partners, you are writing presentations for executives. I need to know that you can do this without me having to copy check everything you've written. If you can't even get your cover letter right, what hope do you have? So, you know, if you've got any doubts, get someone to proofread it for you. Don't make it too long. I got a lot of, well, not a lot, but I got a number of cover letters that were like an essay. And I appreciate the effort and I appreciate the passion, but the reality is if I've got 200 plus resumes to read, I open that email and I think, okay, here we go. Keep it to the point. Just tell me why you're interested in this role and why you write for this role. And don't just repeat your CV. In other words, don't write a cover letter that says, my name is blah, I attended this university, I then had this job, etc., etc., etc. I can see that on your CV. Talk to me about who you are. Tell me something more than I can infer from your CV. Okay. Obviously, I hope, again, this goes without saying, manage your professional identity. I personally am not the sort of recruiter who will go and rifle through your old Facebook photos. Some might, that's not what I do. I don't think it's very fair. But those aspects of your online identity that are clearly professional or semi-professional, just keep them in, keep them in order and put some work into them if possible. I will go and check your Twitter profile. I will go and check your LinkedIn profile. I will check that your LinkedIn profile matches your CV, because that's not always the case. You see people who will interpret their employment background to try and suit the role, but they don't mirror that into LinkedIn. So just be honest. Things like websites and articles you've written and videos, I'm not necessarily expecting these things, but if you have them, that makes me feel good about you. So anything you've done like that, try and evidence it online. Okay, so if you get through that, you're going to get into the interview stage. And if you go for a product manager interview, these are sort of the broad set of topics that you're likely to cover, and I'll go through these each in detail. In fact, at Google, and I know at Yahoo as well, when I was chatting to a recruiter there recently, they literally have separate interviews for each of these categories. So you'll find, with the possible exception of strategic thinking, but you will get a product instinct interview, an analytical skills interview, and a technical expertise interview, definitely. And then design and strategy will probably be mixed in a little bit. Before we do that though, a few general interview tips. Don't panic. And when you get asked a question, listen to the question, take a breath, think about it. Don't be afraid of dead air. It's all fine. Ask clarifying questions. What I mean by that is, although you'll find that at good companies, the person who's interviewing you wants you to succeed. Right? That's the first thing to know, is they want you to succeed. They're not looking to find fault with you. They're not looking to pick. They should not be looking to prove how much smarter they are than you. Interviewing is hard. It's painful. It takes a lot of time. Finding people is hard. And so you really just want the person who's sat in front of you to be the last person you have to interview. But they may quite deliberately not give you all the information because they want to see whether you have the wherewithal to explore the space of the question. So they're looking to you to kind of tease out of them some additional details that might be pertinent. So take a moment to think about the question. Think about what assumptions you're making or you're about to make as you go about answering it. And ask some clarifying questions to check those assumptions. Think out loud. So literally, as you're thinking about things, just talk it out. Because what I want to see is, what is your mental process? How do you go about solving problems? Try and read the interviewer. Are you going in the right direction? Are you spending too much time on a particular point? Are they looking for more detail from you? Engage them in a conversation. They're not just trying to figure out what you know or what you're capable of. They're trying to figure out whether they want to spend 8 hours a day, 50 weeks of the year with you. And they can't do that unless you actually engage them the way that you might over the lunch table. If they give you opportunities, take them. Right? So this is what I mean by show your strengths. So ultimately, as an interviewer, I'm trying to give you a chance to really show me what you can do. And you need to recognize those when they come your way and run with them. So think about, if they ask you a question, don't just give the shortest answer and then stop. think about where can we go from here? What more can we offer them? How can I flesh this out? Again, read them, so make sure you don't go on too long, but take these opportunities. And basically, the people who do well are the people who enjoy themselves, right? They get up the chair, they grab a pen, they start sketching stuff out, and they have a really, really good conversation. Those are the people that make me feel confident. Okay, so let's talk about the individual types of interviews you might get. So product interviews are about understanding your product instincts. Are you able to recognize a good product when you see one? Are you able to visualize ways in which a product could be improved? And my number one tip, if you're in a product interview, is start with the user. What you tend to find, if I look at candidates, is some candidates, those who perhaps don't do as well, if you give them a product question, they will go straight into the implementation. So let me give you an example. Let's suppose I said to you, how would you go about designing an app that helps me find gluten-free bakeries in my town? Right? Some candidates will just go straight up to the board and they will grab a pen and they will draw a screen and they will start, put a map on it, and then they'll put some pins on it, and then they'll put some buttons, and they'll go straight into, I think it should look like this. But the really great candidates, they step back and say, well, tell me a little bit about the user. Who is this targeted at? What are the problems they're having? Why are they not served by existing solutions? How can we help them? Understand who the audience is. Sometimes you'll discover there are multiple audiences. Sometimes you'll discover that there's more than one audience you can cater to. Do not try and come up with one solution for everybody. Instead, pick an audience and then focus on it. And say so. Say, well, I can see that this product could cater to business people, it could cater to students, it could cater to single parents. For the purposes of this interview, I'm going to focus on students. And if the interviewer is not happy with that or was hoping you'd focus somewhere else, they'll tell you, and that's fine. But just focus on one, and then do the best you can to cater to that audience. Identify any constraints. So understand what constraints that the business might or the technology might place on this problem, and then do not try and be too clever. Right? I'm not looking for you to show me some ridiculously elaborate, complicated, and an over-engineered solution. I want the simplest possible solution. So design, a very common approach to design questions is simply for the company to take some part of their product or their website, put it in front of you and say, how would you improve this? I've done this on a number of occasions. And the important thing with these kinds of questions is to first, again, understand what are the goals of this part of the product. What is it trying to achieve? What behaviours is it trying to facilitate? What behaviours is it trying to encourage? In other words, what does the business need users to be doing at this point? Understand a little bit, you might want to ask some probing questions about why it is the way it is right now, because there might be aspects of it that don't make sense to you because you're missing context that was available at the time it was developed. So I'll give you an example of that. If you go onto the Crowdcube website, there's a page that lists all of the investment opportunities we have on the platform at the moment. And if you look at that, you'll think each of those takes up about a third of the screen. They're big cards that we've got on this list, and you might think, well, why is that? I mean, you're making me scroll a long way to get through this whole list. Well, the reason is because when that page was designed, the company was much younger and it only had 4 or 5 pictures live at any moment, and so we needed it to look busy, right? So it made perfect sense then, and it makes no sense now. We're fixing this. But again, it's interesting to understand what constraints it was designed under. And another good question to ask is, what do I need to do to make sure that this product can now scale to be 10 times bigger than it is? Right? Plan for the future. And lastly, and I stress this deliberately, is don't be afraid to say, I believe the following things should be removed. What I tend to find often is that students will assume when they're given these problems that everything on the page is sacred. Right? That everything is needed, everything is there for a reason, and all they can do is rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. But if someone says to me, I don't think that's necessary, I don't think that's a good use of space, I think that's overcomplicating your product, that doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's really impressive. Okay, analytical skills. So the analytical interview is about understanding your ability to break down and solve problems. And what you tend to find is you often get what are called Fermi estimation questions, which is where you're asked to estimate some quantity without any data. Now, obviously, these questions are not real-world questions because you just go look the answer up on the internet. But it's more about understanding how you disassemble the problem. It's also worth understanding that Fermi estimation questions, your performance will not be measured based on how correct you are. In other words, if you have two candidates, the fact that one person got closer to the right answer than the other one isn't a particularly important signal to me. What I care about was their approaches. Did the person who got close because they just got lucky? Or they guessed, or they already knew? Or was it because they used a much better process to get to that answer? So another thing I mentioned here is, obviously show you're working, that's the equivalent of thinking out loud. But what I mean by that is, decide how you're going to solve this problem. So take this example, how many cinema screens in the UK? You could do that by thinking about, well, what's the population of the UK? What percentage of those people go to the cinema? How often do they go to the cinema? And then how many screens are needed to serve that population? Or you could do it another way. You could say, how much revenue does a cinema need to generate in order to survive? Right? What are its costs? And what is per seat ticket price? How much of that do you think is going to the studio? And just look at it almost from the supply side. Either is fine, but decide and then write it out. Write it out almost like a mock equation where you say, these are the inputs, these are how they relate, and this is how we get to the answer. And then break down the inputs further if necessary, and then fill in the gaps based on what limited data you have available. But spell it all out. And lastly, sanity check the outcome. So you've got this great model, you've gone through it, you've got an outcome. Don't go, ta-da, and just assume it's correct because you trust your model. Just step back and look at it and think, is there any good reason I can think of why this may or may not be correct? Again, I'll give you an example. I was mentoring someone, I was preparing them for a round of interviews. And I gave them a question which I specifically chose because I knew that it would never come up in the interview because it's been discussed to death on the internet. I was in the US at the time, and the question was, estimate how many planes are in the air over the US right now. And there's a bunch of different ways of doing this. But this particular candidate, well, it wasn't a candidate, a mentor, went down the route of trying to estimate how many people are flying and then map that to a number of planes, which is a perfectly reasonable approach. And the number of people he came up with that were flying was 100 million. And I said to him, okay, well, let's stop there a second. Tell me this, what is the population of the US? He said 300 million. I said, do you think 1 in 3 people are in the air at the moment? No. So again, it's just a reminder. Sometimes it's just good to step back and say, is there some reason why this is clearly wrong? So you asked about technical skills. And I think with technical skills, as mentioned, it's about communication, it's about understanding concepts. You should not be asked algorithm questions. You should not be asked coding questions. But you will be asked to talk about different technical challenges and approaches to problems. One of my favourite questions to ask is simply, explain to me what happens when I open our website on your web browser. And the beauty of that question is it has almost infinite depth. And you can, and I can get a real sense of how comfortable you are with web technologies. Like, do you understand just the basic stuff? What a URL is, what a web server is, how a web page works, what HTML and CSS and JavaScript is? That's a good start. But actually, can you go a step lower? Can you talk about DNS? Can you talk about routing? Can you talk about sort of firewalls and proxies and so on? You want to go a level down again? You want to talk about wide area networking and BGP and how TCP works? All the better. But I'm not going to expect that. But if you can, that makes me feel good too. Okay. Strategy. So strategy questions tend to be around how you monetize something, or how you would estimate market size, those kinds of questions. They might, for example, take a service that doesn't have a clear monetization strategy or hasn't yet been monetized, it's more in the user growth phase, and discuss how you would do that. The key thing here is to identify where the value is recognized to be by the audience. In other words, does the people coming to this product, do they recognize value in the service you're providing? In other words, let's take an example. Google Maps. Deriving directions are a service, right? The underlying data, which is the road infrastructure, is publicly available. But being able to quickly and effectively figure out the best way to get somewhere in current traffic is a valuable service. But if you look at Street View, the value of Street View is in the data, it's in the imagery, right? That's not in the public commons. And actually, the user experience of Street View isn't that complicated. You just open the right panorama and you look around it. So the value there is in the data. For something like Facebook, the value is in the audience. It's in the set of people that you can reach. Whereas something like Amazon Web Services, the value is in the infrastructure that they're providing you, the tooling and the compute power that you don't have to get elsewhere. So figure out where that is. Figure out where the value is recognized to be, because that's what people will pay for. And I say show awareness of the bigger picture. What I mean by that is, don't just think about how this product could make money or how this product could add value to the business. Put it in context of the broader goals of the business itself. If you were to propose a strategy for monetizing Facebook Messenger that did not align with Facebook's mission to connect the world, then you have a problem. Right? That's not going to work out well. Also, I mentioned don't get hung up on one approach. What I mean by that is, if you can think of lots of different ways you might go about this, then list them all, and then let the interviewer, or if necessary, be proactive and say, let's talk a bit more about this one. All right, we're almost at the end, I promise. So there's a couple of things I want to end with. Firstly, this is a great website if you just want to practice interviewing. It literally just starts a timer and then starts firing product management interview questions at you. It was written by someone who was themselves about to go for some product management roles and wanted the practice. This slide is not specifically about being a product manager, but I just wanted to mention it because it's really, really, really important. I've spoken to a lot of students who are about to start looking for their first job, and many of them are very, very focused just on getting a job. And that's for good reasons. They have a lot of student debt, or they want to leave home, or they just want to get on with their lives. And so they believe that the important thing is to be selected. And what I want to say is, it's just as important for you to be selected too. Like when you are being interviewed, you are interviewing them as much as they are interviewing you. Because ultimately, you will spend an enormous amount of time with these people in this place. And so it better be somewhere you like being, or your life is going to be miserable. And despite what they might tell you in all the recruiting blurb, despite the table football tables, and the company outings, and the chair massage, and all the rest of it, there are only actually 3 things that make a difference on a day-to-day basis between whether you enjoy your work or you do not. And that is the people you work with, whether you're interested in the work you're doing, and whether the culture of the business around you is positive and respectful and supportive. Those are the things you have to figure out when you're interviewing. Do you like the people? Are you going to be doing interesting work? Does this feel like a good environment to be in? Rant over. Okay, so as I said, we're pretty much at the end. A couple of things. This is the website to go with this presentation. Essentially, it's a bunch of supporting materials, including videos of the presentations. This one will go up in a few days once I get around to it. Also, I mentioned I've been interviewing some product managers. This PM Stories section is where those interviews will land. There's a couple up there right now, a few more to go up soon. This site is only about a month or so old, so it's still coming together. But hopefully it's useful. There's also a lot of good links to other resources if you want more information. I mentioned that. And I think we are done.